Hello, Fuel Milwaukee. I want to welcome all of you to today's Race Bridge conversation. As you're coming into the space, go straight to the chat and let us know what you're hoping to gain from today's conversation. So excited to be having this conversation with all of you. It's been a while since we had this webinar format. Last week we were in more of a meeting format and kind of checking in with each other about our mental state and health and wellness and all that good stuff. So it's good to have a panel of experts with us back today. So for those who don't know me, I'm Corry Biddle. I'm the executive director of Fuel Milwaukee, and this is Race Bridge. These are the conversations we've been having over the last several months about race, diversity, racial equity, really an attempt to bridge people through conversation and connection. So before we get started, this is not, I know I kind of look like I'm in front of one of those screen saver things. No, I'm like actually in this space, and it's actually really pretty like this. Some of you know MMAC is moving to the Avenue, and as we're waiting for our space to get ready, we're taking space at this great space called Spaces. Spaces is beautiful, and they've been wonderful in welcoming us and giving MMACers a home to check out our webinar. So I'm on Water Street right now in one of the rooms. So check them out. You see their website there at the bottom, and I'll make sure I email it to everybody in the follow-up notes for today's conversation. So in today's conversation, we're talking about what is the white man's role as a full partner in equity, in the idea of eradicating race and racism. And I've gotten a lot of feedback on this topic and a lot of questions from all of you. Go in the chat right now and put the questions that you have now, because we'll be sure to include your questions in the conversation. But over the last several months, we've been hosting these Race Bridge conversations to foster communication about race and racism. So our goal has really been about providing more insight based on people's perspectives and their own experience, with the goal of really heightening our sensitivity about viewpoints that aren't necessarily our own, or experiences that we haven't had in our own lives. Maybe their ideas and experiences and lifestyles that are outside of the mainstream that we're not as sensitive to because we haven't been exposed to them. So that's the purpose for the Race Bridge conversation. Today's conversation is going to be an interesting one, and it's been on my mind a lot, and you guys too, because you've been letting me know what you think about it, because we're talking about white men in the space of eradicating racism. And often white men are considered the poster board example of privilege. And in my experience, I feel like white men have rarely been engaged openly about their perception of that privilege and what they can do with that privilege to end racism and participate in the work of ending racism. So that's why we're having this conversation. And I want to thank my panel for being here and participating and sharing your own viewpoints and the viewpoints of your identity group. So I'm looking at all the first slide that you see, all of these, you go on the internet and there is, and I can see people kind of in the comments talking about, yes, we're always encouraging our leaders and our white men at work to get more involved in these conversations, and really trying to find ways to encourage folks to be full diversity partners. But then on the flip side, there are a lot of white men, when they're surveyed or asked how they feel about their place in the conversation, that feel that they don't necessarily have a place in the conversation. Not all of them, but I was really struck by this number of folks that say, I don't really know that I'm wanted in the conversation. Some of the quotes that were a supplement to this stat here were, when I'm in the room, I'm not really sure what to say, or I'm not really sure that my opinion is wanted, or, I think people just have different ideas about what it means for a white man to be involved versus the messaging that has been given around race and racism conversation. Those are my personal views on this and why I think it's so important to talk about it. And I'm thrilled to have these panelists here today to give their perspectives and their viewpoints. David Gay is the managing partner at EY. I'm so glad to have you here, David. Thank you so much. Bob Murphy, don't call him Robert, we got to call him Bob. Hey, Bob. VP of Enterprise Change Management at Rockwell Automation. Thanks for being here, all the way from Atlanta.
Yes.
Tim Sheehy is my boss and the president of the Metro Milwaukee Association of Commerce. Hey, Tim, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Corry Joe.
And Kevin Suker is the executive director of Radio Milwaukee. Hey, Kevin.
How are you, Corry Joe?
I like your choice of glasses today.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.
So as we got to get into this conversation, I just want to ask for your initial thoughts or feedback on the screenshots that I showed from the mini. There were so many articles about engaging white men as full equity partners, opinions from white men, opinions from other groups of identity groups. And when you juxtapose those ideas of trying to, we're trying to include everyone with the feeling or the idea that many white men feel like they aren't included. What's your reaction to that? I'll start with you, Bob.
Well, I mean, when you think of what's happening in society today with regard to the tension that exists, to the social inequity, I don't think there's any reality more prominent than the fact that a lot of that begins with white men and the legacy that was left all the way from centuries and centuries ago in terms of their prominence and their power and their influence, and what's turned into, for sure, today, what we call systemic privilege. And I'm sure we'll get into that topic a bit more, but if we're connected inexorably in that regard, in terms of part of the reason that there is this stress, that there are these awkward situations and relationships, we have to be a part of the conversation, which is why I'm glad to be talking today with my colleagues, because we're in it, whether we want to be or not. We may as well talk through it and learn from one another as to what impact can we have within our own culture and where our culture rubs against and intersects with all the others, because they do. We may as well talk about it.
Absolutely. David, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't agree more, right? So the slide you had kind of said, or the 70% wonder if they're wanted in the conversation. I think we are, right? But I guess I'd say whether or not we're wanted, we're needed, right? Because this isn't going to get addressed unless we're involved. And I mean that from the standpoint of, and I think many of us have come on this journey and continue on this journey, right? And will be for a long time, right? But I think have a much deeper appreciation for the privileges that we do have as white males. And it's not something I feel guilty about, right? I can't control that I was born a male, that I was born white, but I better acknowledge, right, kind of my upbringing, and quite frankly, more recently, probably the fact that I have a race, right? I think that's one of the other things that's been harder for white men is it hasn't been an appreciation of we have a race. We just kind of are who we are, and we don't think of race, right? And that's something actually, and gender oftentimes, right, we don't think about. And those are things that other constituents think about a lot. And I just don't know how you solve a problem if you don't have the individuals who are in the majority or the oftentimes real or perceived position of power not engaged in the conversation. It's not going to change otherwise. So that's where I feel like it's absolutely imperative that we're a part of this.
Kevin.
And I feel, I echo exactly what Bob and David said. I came to a realization many years ago, just a little bit of my background. I grew up as the only white man in an all Black company. And I got to see systemic racism firsthand as a passenger with my Black brothers and sisters. And what that did for me, I woke up many years ago and I said to my wife, it's my responsibility to speak up now. It's my responsibility as a white person to stand up and say, this isn't cool. This has to change. So that put me on the path of becoming an accomplice and learning my place in racial equity. And, obviously at Radio Milwaukee, it's paramount to what we do to create safe spaces and to deepen our relationship within the community in the D&I space.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I'd add to this, Corry Joe, is that I love to compete, and nothing sours me more than the lack of fairness or the lack of rules. And so when you play a sport, I think it's just imperative that there are a set of guidelines and rules on which everybody competes, and it creates, as best you can, a level playing field. So the opportunity to kind of continue on, and I think David mentioned this learning journey, and be a part of this conversation on race and privilege and how it unfairly unbalances the game, I think is really important for all of us.
I have a thought about the process of awakening. So I'm sensitive to the fact, you know, I've always been a Black woman, and I was pretty young when I started to realize that my race made me different. The stories that I think about go back to probably 4 or 5 years old. And I wonder if, as a white man, if there was a time along your, was there a moment that set you on a journey to being more aware of what race meant for you and what it meant for other people, and realizing that there is an equity that exists?
You know, Corry, Joe, when I think about that, I have to admit that while I'm now just a couple years north of 60, it really wasn't until I was just south of 50 that I honestly really started leaning into this this whole conversation with an equal amount of my head and my heart. I probably had a decent amount of head conversation and knowledge and thinking about it, but in terms of engaging my heart, we had, as a company, for a few years prior to that, really begun to be introspective about our culture of inclusion. Where were we? Where weren't we? In some regards, needing to wallow in our current reality, but knowing we needed to do something to be about that journey in a much more assertive fashion. So we began to partner with a group that I'm sure many on this webinar are familiar with, and you even mentioned it in part, White Men as Full Diversity Partners, you know, founded by Bill Proudman and Michael Welp. And I remember attending my first of many white men's caucuses, and even be invited to a white men's caucus. I thought, are those legal? What in the world is this thing? But the conversation and the knowledge and the education around these concepts of systemic privilege, around unconscious bias, and around the paradoxes that exist, literally changed not just my life, but the lives of almost all of my colleagues that were a part of that conversation. And we had many such learning labs like that, if you will. But I have to say that it was about a decade ago that I really felt a sense of ownership. And it was mentioned earlier, while I might not be responsible for the state of our culture and the you know, canyons that may still exist, while I might not be at fault, I am responsible to do something about it now. And that those events and that learning and that introspection set me, and in many regards our company, on a trek of an accelerated journey of needing to do something about it. So later in life than I would care to admit, but those are the facts.
Anybody else have a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably multiple moments. I was blessed to grow up with parents who were teachers, and always felt that my sister and I needed to be involved with people who weren't like us. So we hosted international students. We went on work missions to underprivileged communities. There were all sorts of kind of experiences that my parents tried to give us. So I felt like I had an awareness very early on of at least the differences between people and how to connect with one another, and the importance of diversity. And so it's always, in that regard, it's always been important, even though I've grown up in predominantly white, white area. I went to school at UW-Madison, which is predominantly a white institution. I now work for a public accounting firm, which, while we are increasing diversity significantly, is still predominantly white. So I'm still in these institutions and organizations that are predominantly white, but have always felt the importance of diversity and what I can do to help move it forward. But kind of to Bob's point, I mean, and I don't know how many people I've told this now, as embarrassing as it is, right, with what happened earlier this year with George Floyd in particular, but also Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the other stories, it like just hit me between the eyes from a standpoint of just conversations that then I started having with friends who've been friends for a long time, and coworkers, about experiences that they've had, Black, predominantly Black individuals, and just hearing like what it's like to when they get in the car, like how they feel when they get in their car versus how I feel when I get in my car. And I was 46 years old and never thought about that before. And I can't unhear that. I can't unlearn that. And so I feel like this year whatever path I was on for the first 46 years of my life, it just kind of went straight up from a standpoint of my acknowledgement of this is so much bigger and so much deeper than I understood previously, right? And so still have a long ways to go, but I think like a lot of people this year, it just really hit me, and again, just led to conversations that never had before, despite being very focused on having relationships with all sorts of individuals, just not to the level of depth that we had this year.
Tim, have you had any conversations or moments that have accelerated your journey or kind of set you on a path?
Yeah, I think like everybody else on this program, and David said it best, it's almost like a hockey stick. It's kind of an awareness for some period of time. And then as you have conversations, you become much more aware and much more educated about the challenge, the systemic nature of this, and the role that we can all play. And while I have this, I kind of reflect back to my, earliest memories, growing up in Milwaukee in a neighborhood and a school system that was largely white. And at that time, my grandparents lived with us. And it was probably, I was probably 7 or 8 during what we called at the time, the race riots in the summer of '67. And my grandfather was living with us, whose parents had emigrated from Ireland. He had fought in World War I. He was always around the house. So I used to ask him questions. And I remember during this period of time asking him, about the race riots and what the difference was between white people and Black people. And it's not very sophisticated, but his answer always stuck with me. And he said, look, Black people are just Irishmen turned inside out. In other words, they're the same as us. They just look different. And as you kind of work through that, you kind of think, well, okay, they're different, but they're really, they're different, but they're facing the same challenges. And I think as we've talked about this now, people are different, they look different, but it's a much deeper understanding now that the challenges and barriers they face are much different than the ones that I faced growing up. And so I think this has really been a difficult time, obviously, the last couple of years, but I think it has really, almost like a hockey stick, opened up the conversation about where the barriers are, what the differences are, and how we really talk about them in any depth.
Thank you, Tim. Kevin, you talked a little bit about your, working with coworkers that were mostly Black. Maybe that was your moment. Was there some time before or after that is significant on your journey?
Yeah, I was, fortunate in the fact that, being in the music industry, I was around the R&B world from a pretty young age. I want to say my first experience with a group of Black musicians was I was probably 15 or 16 years old. So I was around, Black culture, and I learned it. And I realized that I had a unique responsibility, which was to learn. And I credit the way that my parents brought me up. We were brought up to be very accepting of everybody. I grew up Jewish in a predominantly non-Jewish area, so I kind of had this feeling that I was different, even though my skin didn't show that. I felt very different, and I was treated differently at times. I had my own experiences with anti-Semitism. And I think that kind of led me on a path of having a deeper sense of empathy for people of color and the racial inequities that they faced throughout their lives and existence by no choice of their own, by just the color of their skin, which just, it probably gave me just a different level of understanding. So I credit, being exposed to it, very, very early in my life. And as I look back now, as I'm getting closer to the half-century mark, in January, I'll send my email address to everybody if you want to send me a message. Yeah, it is. what I learned more than anything is that as a white man, I have a responsibility to continue to learn. And it was probably, obviously going back to the Trayvon Martin situation, and everything that we've experienced collectively since then, but it was George Floyd. And I have a 6-year-old who, and I sat and watched the video very early one morning. I didn't want to, because we knew how it ended. And I didn't realize my 6-year-old had snuck up into my office here and was standing over my shoulder. And I had to explain, I wasn't prepared to, but I had to explain to my 6-year-old what we just saw. And, my hopes are when we talk about systemic racism and what is my unique part in trying to change the conversation, it's to have the conversations in my small world, my friends and my family, and to really kind of lay out and challenge, then what would be typically a difficult conversation to have. I'm not afraid of having those hard conversations. And I think, it's our responsibility as white men, especially white men in leadership positions, to not only, create racial equity, but to also, promote these difficult conversations.
So some of the questions that I'll ask or that'll come from the chat are just questions, as curiosities about what it's like to be a white man participating or being around conversations related to race and racism. And others, like the one that's come, the question that's coming, are more about your racial identity group. And all of us have our identity groups, and you, as white men, you have access to other white men in a way that we don't when you are around others that are in your racial identity group or your gender identity group. You're able to have conversations and hear things that people wouldn't say, out in mass. So my curiosity about being a part of that group and what you've heard and what strategically you think needs to happen next is, I know after folks saw the video of the unjust killing of George Floyd and so many others, there was just such a reaction that I had never seen before, such support for the Black Lives Matter movement, such awareness and awakening to anti-Black and anti-Brown sentiment, when in the past, I feel like lots of Black and Brown people feel gaslighted because people were saying, oh, that's not really happening, But I mean, it feels like the switch came on and people started to say, yes, this is happening. And then we saw a lot of companies making statements and putting things on their website. And then it's like, what's next? So as a person outside of your identity group and sort of looking to say, well, as a Black man, you do have some privilege and power that oppressed people don't. What do you think needs to happen next to take that awakening to action, to actually see some changes in the dismantling of systematic racism?
Yeah, I can maybe go first, Corry, George, just thinking about how I'm thinking about it personally. So the first, and I think a number of us have said it, one is spending time listening and learning. I mean, part of it is just needing to recognize I don't understand enough, and I won't ever fully understand, right? But how do I just keep getting a better appreciation and knowing what impact I can make, and hearing stories and perspectives that'll make me smarter about what impact I can have and how I can change things. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about personally is internally at EY, I've been focused for a long time about how we build our culture, and one that's not just diverse, but also inclusive. And a lot of that is also about how I, as a leader in the organization, credentialize either whether it's younger people in a meeting or it's somebody who may not look like me, who's in a discussion, and I can give them my influence to credentialize them, and then people listen to them differently. And I've done that in our workplace for a while now. That's part of leadership, right? And I hadn't thought about how to do that outside the workplace, or put differently, my responsibility to do that outside the workplace. So as a white male in a leadership role, how do I now transfer some of my influence to other voices that are who are less heard in our community, to help raise the issues that are of concern that myself or others like me may not understand? And so that's one of the things that I've been focused on. And then I guess the other thing that I would say is it's also then, it's not just kind of lending my voice or my influence, but I actually need to stand up and do it myself. And so I hope and Tim, I hope has kind of felt it. I've stood up in kind of how we're acting as an MMAC and what we're doing in response to this, and what we're going to do as a business community, and kind of raised my hand and said, what can I do differently? How can I help out? And speaking up more than listening in meetings, and just making sure that I had an active voice. And so just being out there and being okay being out there, even in discussions like this, where, you know, oftentimes you're in, people call them uncomfortable conversations. I think as long as everyone agrees we're having a safe conversation of people wanting to get better and wanting to do better, let's not have it be uncomfortable, right? But it's, you have to put yourself out there. So those are at least the things that I'm thinking about as my own personal responsibility.
Thanks, David. How about you, Bob?
You know, Corry, Joe, when I think about this, you know, you mentioned, everybody's talked about the passion, the attention, the platforms that were elevated as a result of the incidents that occurred over the spring and the summer, right? The rapid fire, tragic nature of them spawned so many people to react, so many businesses to react, to David's point, right? Issuing statements of what we believe a social equity should look like, right? And my goodness, academia, sports, everybody got actively on the bandwagon. My goodness, we changed a state flag, right? As an example. And yet, I think of where we are right now on, what is it, December 3rd here. I'm not sure that the flame is as high. I'm not sure that the passion is as prominent. And so, first of all, personally, I want to make sure that that flame that was rekindled anew in me as a result of those incidences, reminding me of the serious nature of the discord and the discourse and the disconnection that existed, that I personally don't let that flame go out or dim to the point that it was when I was in the thick of just being embroiled in what can I do? I have to be responsible to make an impact here. And I think our corporations need to be every bit as sticky in our prominence and projection of the conversation, the criticality of it, and feeling that responsibility to do something about that with regard to, you know, migrating away from even just an idea around equality to that very different notion of equity. And what does it take to get there? So for me personally, and I think professionally and corporately, it's keeping the flame lit of passion and prominence of this topic and this subject being front and center in terms of our personal and our corporate responsibility to make a difference. Because again, while in some instances, we might not have been at fault for the advent of certain things that have come to pass over literally decades, if not centuries, we are all presently responsible to do something about it. I hope we continue to feel that burden of responsibility.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, you know, I think the other part of this is it's hard to have these conversations in a community or in a company or in an organization where the relationships aren't as deep. But I think it's something that we have to do more of. And I think about this maybe on a more personal basis, where, you know, when I kind of came to the working world, and you at least I did, thought everybody's on the same playing field. This all works the same. And then my wife at the time was working for one of the large accounting firms, and her managing partner held a meeting, and it was at a cabin up north over a weekend. And of course it was, you know, 10 guys and her, and there's no way she was going. And it was, I knew it was there, but I didn't really think about it in that way. And that's an unconscious way in which she got excluded from, you know, taking the next step. And it probably wasn't, nobody meant to do it. It was just the way they worked. And then I watched my daughter come into the workforce, and I'm hypersensitive about that. So I think it's sharing those experiences. And Corry, Joe, you and I have done this a little bit, and I've learned a lot from you on this. When somebody kind of opens up about or has their own experience to share, it really, you know, I think sheds a good focus on what's there that's right in front of us that we don't see. We might acknowledge it, but when it happens around us or to somebody that's a coworker of ours, it just brings it to light in a way that says, we don't want this to continue.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I mean, I think about some of the conversations that we've had and there's this mutual awakening because I assume some of the things that are happening to me are happening to everybody. And it's like, oh, wait, you've never been followed in the store and, you know, you never went to the store and deliberately tried to let people know you weren't stealing. And I mean, I grew up doing that. And I just always assumed that everybody, regardless of race, has been accused of stealing in the store. And, you know, in some of the conversations that I've had, it's like really made me very aware of what racism and segregation has done to me and does to kids, to our children, when they're just kind of, it's this constant hum of racist sentiment, and it really seeps into the bones of all of us, you know, without us really realizing it until we start to talk about it. Kevin, what do you think in terms of like what's next? You know, we've all made our statements, and our companies have kind of, you know, stood against racism, you know, in text, but what's next in terms of action?
I think it's a bigger, I think there's a bigger issue here. It's time to put our money where our mouth is, right? I think we have to not only put something on a web page that says we stand with our Black brothers and sisters, and we have to change the path of racial equity, like Bob said. You know, we have to create new opportunities for people of color. I'm very fortunate that at Radio Milwaukee, it's paramount to who we are. You know, our mission is to connect Milwaukee through, you know, the connective tissue of music and stories for a culturally diverse city. So we have committed very heavily. I would love to share some of our initiatives moving into 2021. We're not quite there yet, but it's very deeply related to what we're talking about today. Very proud to work for an organization that recognizes that's important, and it's important to our community. There's some great corporations in our hometown that are doing some wonderful things, but I challenge everybody to do more. You know, we have a lot of work to do, and it's not, you know, I think the tragic events of George Floyd and the amazing response to Black Lives Matter is just the beginning. It's this awakening, like you talked about earlier, but it should be the impetus to move us and to help us move the needle into real change, right? It's going to take real leadership to stand up and say, we're not okay with the status quo of the way things were. It's time to do things differently. And I really hope that that's kind of the new path forward in Milwaukee and in America.
Part of the reason why I wanted the panel to be all leaders is because I think we've heard and understand that the change really is going to come through leadership, and a lot of the power and influence that you have to affect people's individual lives through, you know, mentorship, promotion, sponsoring folks, just speaking up about policies and procedures. A lot of that is going to come from the folks at the top. So my question, and I kind of want to talk about this, is something that I've always kind of wondered about, just from a human nature perspective. In terms of this idea of privilege and power really being based in whiteness and maleness, I wonder if we all assume that that's true, what is the motivation for a white man to dismantle racism? Or in other words, to eradicate something that to a large extent kind of benefits you? What's the motivation to do away with your own privilege? And I'm asking that question not because I think people just naturally don't want to do it, but I think there might be a human, to me, I'm like, there's a human nature component where you're gonna protect your own self-interest. How do we move away from that for the greater good? How can people of color trust white men to actually do that? I know that's a spicy one, but I had to ask.
Oh, Corry, Joe, I think it's a great question. And, in thinking about that, I honestly believe it's more of an illusion than a reality that privilege that we have come about is necessarily a good thing for us. The tenets of this culture that us white guys swim in, which I will readily admit, 10 years ago, I didn't even know I had a culture, right? That I was part of a race. I just thought I was. But when you begin to understand the tenets of it with the generalities of rugged individualism, right? This, the buck is going to stop with me. It's not going to fail on my watch kind of thinking, that ambiguity is a bad thing. There has to be clarity in all things. And the reality is, operating in that environment, if we continue to perpetuate that by surrounding ourselves with people that either think or just do like that, that's a sorry lot, because we're not taking advantage of really the value of relationship, the value of all kinds of diversity. It isn't just ethnic, it's experiential. It can be geographical. And the fact of the matter is, if any of us have had the pleasure and the honor of creating a leadership team that is truly broadly representative of a multitude of dimensions of diversity, every one of us, I guarantee you, has found that that is a far more powerful constituency of people in terms of getting things done. So is it giving something up to let go of that prominence and that exclusive entity that exists by surrounding yourself with a bunch of white males? Again, I think that's an illusion. There's far more power, there's far more excitement, there's far more advantages to surrounding yourselves with people that have different experiences and different points of views and different upbringings. And I think the proof of that pudding is, again, when we've ever been a part of teams like that, the outcome is the same every time. It's far more powerful where that blend of all those experiential dimensions are brought together. So I, for one, do not want to see any perceived or real advantage, and it is real in many regards, of white male privilege persist, because I think it's an illusion of value and an illusion of benefit. Give me the balance, give me the variation, and I will feel better. The results of what we're trying to get done will be greater, most assuredly. And we truly will be able to cite an example and a shadow of leadership that's effective for people to watch, seeing that happen in an atmosphere that is full of difference as opposed to sameness.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
Diversity, right? Go ahead, David.
Oh, sorry, no, sorry, Corry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Put another way to what Bob's saying. I mean, I'm a firm believer that life isn't a zero-sum game, and so I'm not challenging the premise of your question, because absolutely there are people who have a view that, right, if I give something up, I've done just that, right? I've given something up and I've worsened myself. But I'm a firm believer from when I've done it and what I've seen it, and just you think of the human spirit, that if I share something or if I give something to someone else, that doesn't mean inherently that I've given it up, right? That we can both succeed. It doesn't mean that now they're better and I'm worse, right? Actually, we can both be better as a result of doing it. And I think particularly starting from this position of influence that we have, or this privilege that we have as white, so influence, I say as a leader, privilege, I say as a white male, starting from that, translating that influence, translating that power I don't think is making me weaker. And actually have seen it, that, again, this whole concept, right? Individuals versus teams. And when you get a team that's working together, right, you achieve more. It's just not a zero-sum game. So the premise I understand, but I always challenge it, because I don't think it needs to be about I win, you lose, I win, whatever that might be. And it gets just to probably also some of my views on leadership style around servant leadership. I just have always seen that if my focus is around how do I wake up every day and make those around me better, then I'm going to be successful. and I don't have to worry about my own personal success. And if I think about my role now, if I'm personally successful, but our firm fails, I'm a failure as a leader, right? So it's the same, to me, it's the same concept socially, in that there isn't translating that power, that influence that I was referring to before, in just helping others isn't making me weaker. It's actually raising them up, right? And the entire tide, if you will, is coming up. So that's a conversation, quite frankly, I have a lot of times with people, right, who look at trying to hold on to power. It doesn't need to be the racial discussion. It can be other discussions, right? It's like, what are you holding on to, right? It's not just because you give it up doesn't mean someone else gets it, and you're now, the equation is just somehow balanced differently.
Yeah, I think David's made a great point here. For anybody in a leadership role, the goal is not to step on other people to get ahead. The goal is to really help those around you perform better. That's a mark of a great leader. And that's what makes a company more successful. That's what makes a community more successful. So I think to the extent that we're in leadership positions, we're measured by how we make those around us better. And we can only do that, I think, if we have really diverse teams that bring that kind of thought to the organization. And again, I hate to use a sports analogy, but what team is going to be successful if it's got 5 shooters on the floor? If everybody's the same, we're not going to be as successful. And so attracting that diversity of thought, that diversity of skill set to an organization, and then helping those individuals improve is really what success is all about. And when I step back, Corry, Joe, and think about our work representing the business community and the region as a whole, I look at just the rank disparity that's here in this community by race, and look forward and say, we can't compete if we have a significant number of our Black and brown citizens on the sidelines without the education, without the ability to rise up in their companies. We're not going to be successful. So the answer isn't, how do I sit here and hold on to this little island of privilege, but how do I make everybody around us better? And that way we're going to be much more successful.
Kevin, you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree. I feel maybe the question got a little left of where you were asking. I can just speak for myself, and my feeling and my experience in this world, it's about creating equality in a way that, as a leader, I can create an opportunity for a person of color that also has the power and is governed on their own and not by me. So they don't necessarily have to feel like that my whiteness or my leadership, because I'm a person of non-color, doesn't create an equitable position for a person of color. So I believe, again, like going back to my answer before, putting our money where our mouth is and creating opportunities. I think as a leader, I have a responsibility to the city of Milwaukee to create opportunities for people of color that are not necessarily direct reports to me, but to create new ways of, just equity in that space. And that's, something I'm super committed to in our organization.
Thank you, Kevin. So we're getting close to our open Q&A section. So Marjorie, my colleague, is in the chat right now, kind of culling through all your questions, and she'll ask some to the panel. But before we do that, I'm going to ask my last question. So many questions for you guys, but what would be your advice to, I'm going to stick with your identity group. So what would be your advice to white men who are listening right now that are in organizations and struggling with others in their peer group who are not as woke, who aren't getting it, and they need to speak up and say something? What's the way in which you can do that? You don't want to accuse somebody like you're being racist, even though you might feel that way. How have you gone about calling people out or making them more aware? And what would be your advice for other people on how to do that?
You know, Corey, Joe, the first thing that comes to my mind is I guess I've always had a philosophy that you get more done using carrots than sticks, if you will. My point being is that we can browbeat, and there are times where things need to be said, right? In the moment, there absolutely are. The passivity with which, well, I can't call somebody out on this or that, has to, and fortunately, in many regards, I believe is beginning to end. But I honestly think what's even more effective than that is the simple concept that we all, I think, understand, and it's leading by example. It's casting a shadow of leadership, of response to stressful situations, of being assertive in terms of making a difference, of creating policy that tangibly, favorably affects the situation, not just hoping for better days, but literally architecting better days by virtue of policy and procedure, if you will. So it's setting an example that others will see, because they absolutely will see it creates a better outcome. I think it's just inarguable that when we have a workforce in any setting that is truly representative of the communities that we live in, that it's a better situation, it's a more effective environment, and frankly, it's a heck of a lot more fun. And to be able to do what you can to create that and allow others to see the benefit and the outcomes, hopefully they will wise up and want that for themselves versus digging their heels in the ground and saying, you know, over my dead body. So I just think the examples that we can impart are the most powerful thing we have to offer. And yes, as leaders, they can even be more powerful because that shadow of leadership can be broader. It can be brighter just because of our presence and our availability and whatnot. But it's a personal responsibility. And if we lead by example, I think that can make the biggest difference.
Wholeheartedly agree. And I think I also kind of put my response to when situations occur kind of in two categories. There's just the outright unambiguous racial or inappropriate comments, right? And those, anybody who knows me knows I'm not confrontational, but when those happen, it's my responsibility to say, hey, hold on, right? That's not okay, or I don't believe that. Did I hear you wrong, right? And address it, you know, straight on, because to me, you can't just be silent and go, well, I don't believe that, so at least, you know, I'm not going to say anything to add to it, and that takes courage, right? And it's uncomfortable at times. But thankfully, at least in, maybe I shouldn't be thankful about this because maybe I need to put myself in different settings, but I haven't seen that a lot. But I've done it a few times when I've had to. I think what I've seen much more often is people who say something who you're like, I don't know if they really know how that came across, or if they really knew how that might have been received by others. And those are situations where I think it's important to, you know, on the side, not a direct conversation. Hey, this is what I heard. Like, is this kind of what you meant? Or I'm not quite sure. And I've done that before. And I've been in situations where people are, oh my goodness, I can't believe I said that. Or other times we're like, well, yeah. And then you say, well, why do you think they didn't have a conversation? I guess my point is in this day and age, I think it's really easy to judge people. And I think we have to be careful in all these conversations to meet people where they're at to advance the conversation. And a lot of times we bring our own perceptions of what we think maybe a racial comment and put that on someone versus saying, well, let's just have a conversation. This is what I heard. Is this what you meant? And just get into that conversation. And so that's how I've kind of approached on the one-on-one. To me, there's this is a bad, the black and the white, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, that's just overtly wrong and needs to be addressed flat out. And then there's a whole bunch of gray that needs to be, in my mind, kind of addressed in a way of let's get to a meeting of the minds, rather than me trying to impart my wisdom upon you or trying to convince you that you should think something differently. Let's just advance the dialogue.
Yeah, and Corey, Joe, I'd add a third one to David's category, and that is kind of the after or before meeting sidebar discussion that happens, where somebody says something almost kind of drawing you in, like you think that way too. And I think that's a place where we have to make a much firmer stand in saying that's just not acceptable. Because I think David's right, it's happened much less now in a public setting. It's much less acceptable. It never should have been acceptable. But that conversation now where it occurs kind of happens after the meeting or in a sidebar conversation. And I think we have to be just as diligent there about addressing that and not just walking away going, boy, I shouldn't have let that go.
Yeah, because it sticks with you. It's like, oh, I should have said something. Yeah. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, these are all great responses as to how to handle it. I think a little bit differently. I think that we have a responsibility to learn, and I was going to try not to mention this book called White Fragility, but I think it's very important. I think it's super important because, you know, we have a responsibility to understand the complexities of what racism truly is. And it is not just, you know, this one big, you know, person in a white hood. Yes, that is a racist, but there are complexities to racism that white people don't necessarily even recognize that they're participating in. And I think if we can learn the deep dive about what racism truly is, not only as in our city, in one of the most racially segregated cities in the country, but and how it has played into the fabric of who we are as America. I think that's what's going to allow us to not only have the conversations that we were talking about, but learn from one another in ways of truly, you know, changing the equity conversation, right? And understanding what has prevented, what allowed me to get here today at this point in time in my life and the path that I took, and recognizing that my Black brothers and sisters didn't necessarily have the same path. It doesn't make me a bad person that I was born a white man, but I have the obligation to understand what everybody else that we're talking about has gone through.
Thank you, Kevin. I just posted a link to the book you referenced to in the chat for those who are interested in that resource. All right, I'm going to go to Marjorie, who's going to bring in some of your questions. Marjorie, do you have any questions? Are there any questions in the chat at all?
None at all. Well, I think the question that kept coming back was how you deal with white people that are racist, both at work, in your families, who are a friend, a colleague, and I think it's all very different. David kind of touched some on that. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis, not just at work?
Like friends, family, Thanksgiving, Christmas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, well, I don't want to say the same thing, but I guess I view my responsibility or my relationships kind of the same internally and externally when it comes to the work setting. And so I've had similar conversations with friends over the years, or again, more in-depth conversations more recently. And I think it's, again, just, I don't know, the phrase that I use, and it's too strong in this situation, but there's a quote out there that says it's hard to hate up close. A lot of time when I sense the conversation's kind of getting to this like us versus them, or that's not right, or that, it's like, just hold on, like, let's just try and understand one another, because my guess is we're a lot closer, a lot more common than we may believe, right? Despite even how significant that gap may be. And so I think it's just having the courage to have the conversation and just trying to be authentic with someone and just say, hey, look, I'm not trying to change you. Now, does that mean I'm not hoping to influence them? No, right? I mean, that is what I hope, because I believe passionately in what I believe. But I'm also a firm believer, if I just come on saying I am holier than thou, I have this right and you're wrong, the conversation's going to stop and we're not going to get anywhere. And so it's hard, because it's in my mind these days, it's expanding to almost every single topic, whether it's political, whether it's racial, whether it's economic. It's very easy to go into your echo chambers and only talk to the people who think like you, right? And how do we kind of reach across and have those conversations? So this is, to me, an extension of just how do we connect as a society. And well, so I don't know. I guess that's my perspective.
You know, David, I agree with that. I think there's one other factor that we need to be conscious of, and that is that, you know, culture plays such a prominent role in the happenings of all of our corporations, of our families for that matter. And I think there was a time when we thought culture was some kind of a icing on the cake, that if you got it, it tasted even better, but it wasn't the main ingredient. And I think now we're recognizing very clearly that culture is the enabler of all good things that come out of any institution. It is the means to the end. And to that question that was asked, if there is divisiveness and or hatred that is counter to the integrity and the culture of an organization, it's every bit as problematic, in my viewpoint, as someone that is not being considerate of, let's just say, a customer or a client. It matters just as much. In fact, it may matter even more, because it can be so much more pervasive in terms of how people see and respond and draw perceptions of what's acceptable within the culture. So I think that if we see behaviors that are out of the bounds of our accepted ideals from a cultural perspective, we need to think about dealing with those every bit as forthrightly as we would you know, a financial misgiving or a customer interaction problem and concern. These things need to be treated and viewed on the same playing field. Of course, the approaches and the nature of how you have conversations changes, but they're just as important in my view. Culture drives the outcomes of every company. And if there are things that are degrading the culture, our brand promise at Rockwell Automation is to expand human possibility. And that's for our customers, that's for our stakeholders, that's for all of our employees. And if something is going against that grain, it matters and it needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Bob. All right, Marjorie, one more. We'll do a quick round of rapid fire. You have one more?
I'm curious how each of you currently work to recruit and retain a diverse staff at each of your organizations. What do you hope to achieve over the next year? What's been your experience during this year, especially under conditions of the pandemic? And how has that affected the composition of staff, if at all?
That's a good one.
There's a ton there. I think I would say we've been for a while, and I would say with an increasing focus, you know, challenging where we go to recruit. So which school? So as a public accounting firm, we hire essentially almost always college graduates, and so it's about currently. What's interesting is we're also having a conversation about credentials and what credentials really matter, and is a college education necessary. So that's a whole nother kind of frontier of, I would say, dialogue that we're having internally, which gets a little bit to the conversation we're also having here. But I think challenging where we go, right? A lot of us who grew up in the organization came from certain universities, and that's where we go back to, right? And if we're looking to change culture, if we're looking to increase diversity, then we need to look elsewhere oftentimes, because in my case, from UW-Madison, there's just not a high minority population that attends UW-Madison. So that's not where we're going to find likely a lot of diversity. So we're challenging where we're going. I would say we're also challenging, you know, as much as attracting, it's also about retaining, right? And so a heavy focus on how are we there for all of our employees. And it gets to my point before, right? If any, well, I would just say how we are increasing retention and what we can do, right? How we can react to support, particularly our Black and Latinx professionals who are, from an ethnicity perspective, are our largest minorities, and what sort of infrastructure do we need to continue to put in place to help them in our culture? As much as we want to be as inclusive as we are, there's still a difference with people coming in from different backgrounds. So I guess my point would be challenge where we go to find the people, but then also challenge once they're with us, how we're going to support them.
Tim, tell them about region of choice a little bit.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do, Corry Joe, is just to allow you to send out the document that we have. David's on our board. Rockwell's
Okay.
been very involved in this, and I think it would be interesting to have a future discussion around the initiative to become a region of choice for all. And it's really a focus on just what we've talked about, which is how do we as a business community source differently? How do we retain and how do we advance diverse talent? And I think there are a number of strategies there that will be really impactful to the community and really worth talking about in a future one of these race bridges, to just get feedback on the strategies that we're going to deploy over the next 5 years to help Milwaukee move towards that goal of being a region of choice for all.
That's great, because you're going to let me send the document. It's not public yet, y'all. This is like exclusive stuff here. Bob, Kevin.
Well, I think when it comes to being intentional, there's a lot of very practical things we can do. And as David said, every bit as much around retention and being intentional about changing that whole outcome of are we keeping the talent and the people that we should to help engender a more diverse and reflective workforce of our community, as well as attracting and acquiring new talent. But I think there's a lot of very practical ways and means that can happen with regard to how sourcing is done, how interviewing is done, what goals and objectives do we set against trying to create diverse teams at all levels of leadership. For example, do we just look at broad categories of numbers and say, it was X, it needs to be X plus, but what if the X plus really needs to be in a certain area within that population, right? Are we adding to maybe just newer hires or lower on the leadership scale, or are we having an all-out intentional program to make sure that all levels of leadership and all core roles and responsibilities in the organization are getting where we need them to be reflective of the communities that we lead in? A lot of those things can be very practically vetted out and promoted by goals and objectives, and that's something that Rockwell has been for a long time and continues to be, I would say, even more deliberate and more intentional and more specific around the categories of creating that equity that needs to exist within our workforce. It doesn't need to be rocket science. It needs to be intentional, though.
That's good. I like that. We can make a t-shirt, Bob. Kevin, last thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the panel here. All of those are just great ideas. You know, we've got real challenges ahead of us. This is going to be a difficult year. 2021 is obviously, I'm not saying anything that we all don't understand, but you know, Google just announced that they're going to diversify their workforce in Chicago. That means they're going to pull talent from Milwaukee. And it just means we have to challenge ourselves to find new innovative ways to not only find deeper pockets, but to retain. And we're committed to that at Radio Milwaukee.
Thank you all so much for having this conversation with me. People in the chat have really seemed to enjoy it, enjoy your insights and your honesty and openness. I really appreciate you guys, Kevin, Tim, Bob, David, you're awesome. So I'm 6 minutes over with our time, so I know you all have to go, but I have a treat for you, Kevin. My final screen share.
Are you going to sing?
Oh, kind of.
Okay.
I'm gonna play this. Milwaukee Strong. So all of the fuelers know at this point in the conversation, we want you to go straight to the chat and let our panelists know how much you appreciate them and their insights, their openness, their honesty. Go straight to the chat. Let them know how much you appreciate them. Folks on Facebook, the same thing. Leave your comments. And I always like to end with something that's very Milwaukee and something that aligns with the spirit of the Race Bridge Conversations. And there's no better music video right now than this Milwaukee Strong video that Radio Milwaukee was heavily influenced. So in putting together. Kevin, do a quick intro so people know what they're seeing. I played it before, but let them know what this collaboration was all about. And as I'm playing this, drop your notes and then you get back to work, guys. What are we looking at, Kevin?
Wow, thanks, Corey Joe. This is a really amazing endeavor that we partnered with our friends at Imagine MKE with. And we brought together an amazing group of local musicians to write an anthem for the city, led, written, and produced by our very own Sean Hinton, who has toured with Mary J. Blige and Lil Wayne and John Legend and Jill Scott. Just an amazing gift to the city. And Ken Brown painted a mural. It was a really an amazing program. We were very honored to be a part of.
It's a great song, and I think it could be our theme song. For the panelists, again, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Go into the chat and enjoy the love notes that the Fuelers are sending you. I'm going to play the song, enjoy it as long as you want to, and then you can hop off and go on back to work. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Corey Joe.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Milwaukee strong. From the ashes and the dust, we will rise, we'll all stand up.
With hope in our eyes, we'll go on. We will rebuild brick by brick, stone by stone.
Through the fire, through the rain, our tomorrow will be a better day. 'Cause we are proud of what we know. We are the good land, Milwaukee strong.
Milwaukee strong like black coffee, yeah. Milwaukee black and brown, so please change policy, yeah. Milwaukee less work or ended poverty. Milwaukee growing, let's make sure that we grow it properly, yeah. Milwaukee home, so let our love show. Milwaukee special, invest in the homegrown talent. We all searching for balance, united the good lands, approaching all of our challenges.
Hand in hand, you and me,
Working together like a family. Together we stand through it all.
hand in hand, standing tall. Every day, in every way, spreading love, and Milwaukee way. Loud and proud, through and through. This is who we are. This is what we do. Through the rain, our tomorrow will be a better day. 'Cause we are proud of what we know. We are the good land, Milwaukee strong. We are the good land.
We are the good land, Milwaukee strong.
God bless the good land, Milwaukee strong.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye, fuelers.